this. I am pleased to introduce to you Miss Galusha, who is coming to speak to us about, as I told you, the New Deal and some of the work, both locally and globally, that the New Deal has completed. So that's all for me. And she's going to do a presentation and interact with you, and please ask questions and learn. Go.
Hello. My name is Diane. Thanks for inviting me. The 1930s is a really interesting era. How many of you guys are into history at all? I mean, in general, liking to talk about and think about history. Because the 1930s is a really pivotal time in American history. And it was a very difficult time. Name one thing that was going on in the 30s. Great Depression. And so the New Deal was an effort to get the country through it and beyond the Great Depression. So I'm starting with this, this slide that shows the variety of activities that the federal government did to and launched to employ people, to help communities, and basically to give people hope. That was the critical thing in the 1930s. The stock market crash in 1929 precipitated the Depression, which caused about a quarter of the working population of this country to be out of work. 25%. That was many millions of people. So, and some examples of what the New Deal, I'll go a little bit more into detail with that, but I just wanted to show you this slide. Anybody recognize anything local here?
The Durham School.
Yeah? The Durham School was one of hundreds and hundreds of schools around the country that were built during this era by the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, and the PWA, I can't remember what it's called now, Public Works Administration. There were two different agencies that really did the same thing, which would put adults to work building things like schools, building things like, who recognizes this bridge?
That's cool.
Anybody recognize that bridge? It's not on the East Coast.
The Golden.
That's right.
Oh, yeah.
You got it, yeah. Golden Gate Bridge. So there was a lot of infrastructure. There were a lot of water systems and sewer systems and highways and bridges and schools, town halls, post offices were built all around the country to put people to work and to improve the base of the economy, which is, of course, our communities, small and large. This is a hiker on the Appalachian Trail. Is anybody here a hiker? Have you heard of the Appalachian Trail? The Appalachian Trail is the longest. I don't know if it's the longest foot trail because there's another one a couple of them in the west that might be longer, but it runs. How many? 2,000 miles from Mount Katahdin in Maine to Springer Mountain in Georgia. You can walk that whole route on this trail, and much of this trail was developed by the Civilian Conservation Corps, which I'm going to tell you about in a minute. First, I just want to point out this. Does anybody know what this is? This is a mural. I looked up online to see if, in fact, there are any murals that were created during the 1930s here in Greene County, and I couldn't come up with any. I don't know if anybody else knows any, but there were lots and lots of post offices around the country, and the federal government, the Works Progress Administration, and the Treasury Department, for some reason, I don't know why it was the Treasury Department, thought it would be a really excellent idea to employ artists and writers and theater people, who are all of these people. You know, they're doing what they know how to do. They're creative people trying to earn a living doing what they do. And what's the first thing that usually goes when there's a budget cut or breakdown? The arts, right? Maybe you don't know that, but that's kind of, it seems, in a lot of quarters, it seems to be an expendable thing. So the federal government employed lots and lots of artists around the country to create these beautiful murals in public spaces, very many of them in post offices that were constructed during the Depression, during the New Deal. This is a mural that is in the Hyde Park Post Office, and it shows natural resource-based industry, logging and seine netting in the Hudson River. So are you guys going to Hyde Park?
We are in April.
In April, cool. Well, you're probably not going to stop at the post office. Only know that it's a pretty wonderful place. And I actually went west a few years ago, and with the idea that I would try to find every mural I could find along the way. It was a great treasure hunt. And there are many of them, and they are treasures. So look for them the next time. If anybody goes to Delhi, anybody know where Delhi is? Kind of a ways from here. It's a great one in Delhi, which is the county seat of Delaware County. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Civilian Conservation Corps. I think that's why I was asked to come. It was called Roosevelt's Forest Army. The Civilian Conservation Corps, otherwise known as the CCC, you will learn that the CCC was one of many agencies and initiatives during this period that had initials. What is it called when you call something by an initial, like the CCC or, sorry? No? You could call it an abbreviation, but it's also known as an acronym. You know, when you have letters that stand for the agency or the initiative. So the FDA is the Food and Drug Administration, the EPA is the Environmental Protection Agency, the CCC was the Civilian Conservation Corps, and this agency put young men to work in the nation's parks and forests, and they were paid $30 a month, $1 a day, and they had to, which really was quite a lot of money then, especially for young people whose really only alternative might be to be on the streets or to be working on a farm for a couple bucks a week. So this was a good deal for young people. They had to take $25 of that $30 and send it home to their parents or their family or their dependents. If they didn't have any dependents, some of them didn't have any family, that money was put in an account for them for when they got out of the CCC. It was kind of like a savings account. But there were a lot of families who were struggling to exist, struggling to pay the bills, pay the rent, and put food on the table for the rest of the kids. So it was, in many cases, up to the older, young men in the family to go off and try to make some money for the family. And in this case, the CCC offered them a way out or a way in, if you want to put it that way. So everybody knows who this is, right? Somebody might want to take up this little research project and find out who Roosevelt Road or Roosevelt Avenue just down the road here was named for. You know where I'm talking about? Just back down 145, is it Roosevelt Road? Street? Avenue? Somebody wants to look that up and see if it was a local family or if in fact the road was put in during the 12 years of FDR's presidency, maybe in honor of him. You see a lot of Kennedy Avenues and Kennedy Streets around for that reason, so that might be an interesting thing to do. So the Civilian Conservation Corps was established in 1933. Now, Roosevelt had been the governor of New York State for 2 years, and he instituted something like the CCC in New York State, putting people to work in parks and planting trees and such, and found that it was very positively received, and it was a success. So when he got to be president, the first thing he wanted to do was do what he had already done successfully. So he beat, who did he beat? Anybody know who the president was before him? Herbert Hoover. Yeah. So a lot of people blamed Herbert Hoover for not doing enough, not working quickly enough to end the Depression. So they were ticked off, and they elected Roosevelt by a landslide. So by the time Roosevelt took office, a quarter of the nation's workforce, as I mentioned, was out of work. Mortgages had been foreclosed on thousands of homes and farms. There were bank failures, so people who had their money in banks lost it. Factories shut down, putting a lot of people out of work. Mines closed, railroads went bankrupt. Men who had been able to support their families were basically forced to sell apples on street corners or to get into, hop a boxcar and go someplace else looking for work. Well, the situation was really dire. Here's a homeless family on the road. Entire families, went with wagons of their belongings. Here's a bread line in New York City. Look at how many people really needed food. Really a very desperate time in American history, and it went on and on and on for years. So the situation was pretty dire also for teenagers and young men. They were, if there was a job available, it usually went to a breadwinner, the adult in the family. And teenagers, were left out in the cold, literally sometimes. It was estimated that there were 5 million unemployed teenagers during that period. So a lot of them quit school when they were 13 or 14 or 15 to try to help their families, and they hitchhiked around the country in search of work. So FDR wasted no time in rectifying this situation. 5 days after he assumed the presidency, he called together the Secretaries of War and Agriculture and the Interior, the Director of the Budget, and others to discuss his idea of putting unemployed young men to work on forestry, flood control, soil erosion, other natural resource conservation projects. It only took them hours to agree. Now, you guys know what's going on in Washington today, right? Can you imagine this really happening today? Everybody being behind the effort to drag the country back to normalcy. So really it won passage in the House and the Senate less than 3 weeks later. So the Emergency Conservation Work Act created what came to be known as the Civilian Conservation Corps. So there were 4 government departments and 26 different agencies who combined forces to get this off the ground. So the Department of Labor set up the system to enroll young men aged 18 to 25. How old are you guys?
13.
13? Anybody 15? I met a couple of guys who lied about their ages to be able to get into this program. So, people would do anything pretty much to be able to have work. So work sites were established, projects were developed. The War Department, and this is pretty key, it was called the War Department then, not the Department of Defense, was given the challenge of organizing these enrollees into companies. It was really kind of run very much in a military manner. The War Department was in charge of feeding and clothing and equipping and housing all these young men and supervising their life in specially constructed camps across the country, also in Alaska, in Puerto Rico, in Hawaii, and in the Virgin Islands. So on April 6th, less than a month after the president called that first meeting to discuss this new initiative, the first recruit was enrolled in Pennsylvania. On April 17th, the first Camp Roosevelt, opened in Luray, Virginia. By July 1st, 1933, this is just, 4 months or so after the president took office, there were 1,300 camps in operation, and there were 275,000 enrollees already in those camps. Over the next 9 years, this program ran for 9 years, 3.5 million young men would serve at 4,500 civilian conservation corps camps, and they became known as Roosevelt's Forest Army. So there were 208 CCC camps in New York State, and they operated for different periods of time and for different purposes. Many of them worked on forestry and stream restoration projects and campground development in the Catskills and in the Adirondacks. 44 camps developed state parks outside the Catskills and the Adirondacks. I don't know if any of you have been to Fondstock, the Palisades, Lake Taconic, Pound Ridge, Bear Mountain. All of those were developed by the CCC. So here's how the system worked. Companies of about 200 men were often moved from camp to camp around the country, and their makeup changed as enrollees came and went. Men signed up, you only had to sign up for 6 months. You know, and if you thought you had a job on the outside, after 6 months, you could leave honorably. You'd get an honorable discharge. There was a lot of the verbiage that was used was very military. So you could get an honorary discharge after 6 months, or you could sign up for another 6 months if you still didn't have a job. And you could do that 3 times. You could stay in for 18 months. After that, you had to get out and leave your spot for somebody else to take it. And then 6 months later, then you could rejoin if you still needed to. Some went over the hill. Anybody know what over the hill means? Over the hill is kind of a funny phrase, and it really means it's going AWOL. Anybody know what AWOL means? That's another term that's used. Absent without leave. If you didn't feel like staying there anymore, maybe you had a problem with an officer, or maybe you didn't like the guy your bunk was next to, or maybe you were just tired of working so darn hard, they just left. But they were given dishonorable discharges, and that tended to haunt them years later if they wanted to enlist in the Army. So the $5 a month that they could keep, they spent on toiletries, for instance, if they're shaving gear maybe, or recreation. They would go to the local roller skating rink or go bowling, or down to the tavern and buy nickel beers. They didn't have to lie about their age to do that, but they did. So they were given work clothes, uniforms, shoes, boots, coats, rain gear, underwear, and not incidentally, 3 square meals a day. This was the first time in years some of these men, these young men, had had 3 meals a day, starting with a big beefy breakfast, and lunch in the field usually, with a big barrel of hot coffee, and then a big dinner at night. So, and in many cases, that was more important than the money that they were earning, was the food. So, let's see, I want to tell you about the little villages here. So anyway, these are 3 camps that are up in the Catskills. Margaretville, where I live, Boyceville. Anybody been to Boyceville? In Ulster County, and this is Tannersville. Anybody been to Tannersville? Mm-hmm. North-South Lake is up there. That's another park that was developed by the CCC. Mm-hmm. Let's see if, yeah. So here's another image of guy. I mean, when you see these pictures, except for one which I will show you later on, just about all these guys are smiling. Why do you think they're smiling?
They're having a good time. Because they're having a good time.
They're having a good time. Yeah. They're thrown in with a bunch of people who maybe are not just like them. There were a lot of city guys that were sent to these very remote camps all over the country, out in the Rockies and out in the Southwest and the desert, here in the Catskills. And there were also local guys, because they had to have a certain percentage of people from the neighborhood were allotted spaces in these camps. And there were only 200 people usually in a camp. So the local guys, who probably had never been to New York City, and these new, very street-savvy New Yorkers, or from other cities, would get together, and they would find common ground in this hard work that they were doing. I will also say that African Americans, as was the case during that era, were segregated. What does that mean? Sorry? Kept in separate camps. Yeah. And there were also camps for Native Americans on or near reservations. So here's a family that's benefiting from the $25 a month sent back by their son. And these guys don't look much older than you guys. And they probably aren't. But look how skinny they are. I mean, they're just these, young guys that are now living away from home for the first time in their lives. And, basically making their way in the world. I interviewed 3 guys who went to the Margaretville camp. 2 of them were 15 years old when they signed up. One was living on Long Island, and his family just couldn't support his father just couldn't support the family. So he knew his mother and probably his father would not allow him to sign up for this because he was only 15. But he snuck away anyway, went to the recruiting station, lied about his age. Apparently they didn't ask for much documentation, and signed up, borrowed 2 cents to buy a stamp to put on a postcard, to send it back to his mother to tell them what he had done. And he didn't see them again for 6 months. There was another guy who was living in an orphanage. He had no family at all. And he and another guy said, let's just go to the CCC, even though they were like 16. And they too lied about their age, got shipped to the Catskills, which is not where they wanted to go. They wanted to go to some wilderness place out in the Rockies. He was quite an adventurer, ended up being a paratrooper in World War II, and then a window washer on the skyscrapers in New York City. So the guy liked high things. And then there was another young guy from Downsville, which is just up the road from Margaretville, who was the second oldest in his family. And there were 13 kids in the family. And he was pushed out of the nest, really, quite literally. And he walked 20 miles to Margaretville and signed up at the camp there. So it was a great opportunity for a lot of these guys. And here's some of the officers in the Margaretville camp, and you can see that they had uniforms that in many ways resembled World War I uniforms. Does anybody know when World War I took place? You want to guess?
1914.
1914 through 1918. So there were still these hot wool uniforms left over from the war. And that's what these officers were wearing, and that's what the first recruits in the CCC also wore. So they did a lot of manual labor. This is Gilbert Lake, which is a state park in central New York. And they developed quite an incredible campground there. This is Margaretville's camp. You can see how neat and tidy it was. I mean, they were put to work also just kind of landscaping the grounds. They lined all the roads with these rocks and painted them white, they did a little whitewashing. This is the headquarters building. They had these trucks, and so they had to have a garage and mechanics to service the trucks. Here's another. I have no idea what's in that bottle. I would love to know what's in that jug they're pouring there. But so this was the company 1230. Each camp had a different company in it, and sometimes the companies moved from camp to camp. So women, you young women in this audience may be interested to know that women were not allowed in the CCC. Does that surprise anybody? But at the urging of Eleanor Roosevelt, who was First Lady, And she was assisted by Frances Perkins. She's also another person that you all might want to know about. Frances Perkins was a female Frances. She was the first female Secretary of Labor and first female cabinet member ever. She and Eleanor Roosevelt worked together to devise a way to house homeless and jobless young women, because there were lots of young women who had no place to be either. And I will tell you one thing, women were not comfortable hanging out in those bread lines and waiting in line, you know, for the food and the soup kitchens and such. Though, because there were many, many men, they were harassed often, and they just didn't feel comfortable. So they were really kind of on the outs there. So this is called Camp Terra at Bear Mountain State Park, and this was a gathering of young women who were allowed to be there, and they didn't get paid anywhere near what men got paid. Then they got paid like 50 cents a week or something like that. But this is when Eleanor Roosevelt came to visit. So there were 90 of these camps set up around New York State, and they were called, what do you think? Not CCC camps. Get it? She camps. All right. So 8,500 women were protected in this way, as opposed to the millions of young men who went to the CCC camps. So another cohort of the population who was assisted after a year or so of the CCC were veterans of World War I, who by then would have been, you know, whatever, in their 40s, right, or 50s even, and also veterans from the Spanish-American War, which was around the turn of the century, 1900, 1902. So there were a lot of these men who were out of work, but they were not 17 to 25. So they were set up in special camps to accommodate them. The other thing that is interesting about this is that there were men who were in the local communities, in Margaretville, in Tannersville, in Boyceville, and in all the other places where there were camps. Men who lived in the vicinity, who knew how to use an axe, or knew how to fix a truck engine, or any one of a number of other things, you know, were medical practitioners. They were employed to teach these enrollees how to use an axe, how to use something like this. I mean, if you were a kid from Brooklyn or grew up in the Bronx and you were sent to the forest and said, okay, here you go, dig a ditch, you wouldn't have a clue how to use this properly. You might have a clue. So I got this on eBay, by the way, and on the end of the handle it says CCC. It's pretty heavy, brilliantly designed. It totally self-balances. And that would have been used for digging trenches. And there was another tool that they used more often for planting trees, which I'll show you in a minute. But anyway, these folks who were the technical staff were the local people that helped these young guys know what they were doing, were called local experienced men, LEMs, L-E-M's. So CCC enrollees worked 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, and that was another major thing. You know, any other job on the outside was not an 8-hour job usually, and it certainly wasn't 5 days a week. So this was kind of cushy by comparison, even though it was very hard work, done in all kinds of weather. And when they weren't eating, they were sleeping. They were relaxing and playing. There were ball teams, baseball, basketball. They played the local town teams. They got dressed up and went out to dances on a Saturday night. I don't know what they're doing here, having some kind of fun with the wheelbarrows. There was a big wrestling thing too. They wrestled, then boxing was a huge thing. So they went, some of these guys who were really good boxers would go from camp to camp and take on all comers, and so they had things that they could do that were fun. Here's a field day at Gilbert Lake, all but one airborne here. And here's a guy who brought his dobro in. A lot of these camps had their own little orchestras or country western bands, and they played for the public. Sometimes they invited the public in to have parties and meet some of the guys, because, you know, it was tough being in a camp with 200 other guys, and you didn't get to see women unless you went out, you know, to the community. And there were a lot of communities who were not so sure about having 200 strange boys in town, you know, if they had daughters. So they, you know, it was a kind of very curated kind of life, if you will. They had the barracks, as you can see, were big and airy and empty, not insulated. They were only meant to be temporary, and they were heated by these wood stoves. So you kind of wanted your bunk to be sort of near the wood stove. Here they're reading. Look, they had to do their own laundry, so they hung it up in the bunk in the barracks, and they're reading their newspapers. And there were also classes. Somebody had the brilliant notion that once the economy improves and the CCC camps closed, they were going to have to do something. So what were they going to do? So they offered classes like, you know, training how to be an electrician, what to, you know, or just reading and writing. A lot of them had, you know, left school early, didn't really know how to read very well or write very well. So they got a lot of instruction in all kinds of, you know, radio, other kinds of plumbing, other kinds of careers or occupations. This was the Boyceville camp. This kind of just shows you how they were laid out. Right. This was later replaced with a sawmill, and now if you go there, it's just a strip of commercial buildings. Actually, the Aniora Central School was right across the road from this big campus, but you would never know that had been there. Here's an aerial view of another camp. You can see how they all look pretty much alike. They were all, you know, kind of near the streams. So Boyceville, that camp I just showed you, was among the first CCC camps to be set up in New York State. It opened in June of 1933, which is just 2 months after the first camp was opened in Virginia. So this is an ailment that affects white pines, this blistering. This is the plant, the gooseberry plant, that harbors the white pine blister rust organism. So there were other diseases too that were affecting trees, which, by the way, what you learn when you learn about the CCC is they planted millions, if billions actually, of trees around the country. So they had to do something to protect them from diseases and from fire. And so they sent the enrollees out to hack away the gooseberry bushes so that the white pines that they had just planted would not be infected. They looked for gypsy moths. You guys know gypsy moths, right? At that time, gypsy moths were confined to Long Island. They had not made it up here to the Catskills. So the guys in Boyceville, which is 8 miles from the Hudson River, were put in charge of going to look for gypsy moth egg clusters as like the first line of defense. And they never found any. The conservation people who were organizing these work crews would tack fake egg clusters around in the forest and try to and see if they could find them. But they never found any real ones, I was told. They built habitat for fish. They built flood control structures. This is the fire tower at Slide Mountain. Anybody hiked up Slide Mountain? Yeah? It's quite a hike, isn't it? There's no fire tower there anymore. But it was, so fire towers were among the big projects that many of the camps in the region did. Why did they do that? Why did they build fire towers? What did I just say? So that they could, so that the fire tower observers who worked for the state could determine when a fire had broken out nearby and to protect the plantations that they had just planted. This is Woodland Valley. Has anybody gone to Woodland Valley? It's just on the other side of Slide Mountain. There's two approaches to Slide Mountain, and this is one of them. This is the last remaining building at Woodland Valley State Campground that was built by the CCC. And this is a pretty interesting situation. This was the state's first mechanized ski area. And it was down in Phoenicia, near Boyceville. It was called Simpson's Ski Slope, and it was constructed between 1934 and 1936. It bordered state land, and so the family that owned it sold a couple acres to the state, which made them eligible to have the CCC come and work on this public land. And they created this totally terrifying looking ski slope. And they had these, so they brought the train in. The train would back up, would come up on Route 28 and then would back up the valley on this siding, bringing up to 500 people from New York City, and a rental car, railroad rental car with all their skis and everything in it. And so these guys would get out, these people would get out. If they hadn't brought their own skis, they would rent them in the railroad car, and then they would be towed up this mountain by just a regular tow rope, you know, like with a little, not even a seat, really. They had to hang on actually with two hands. I don't know how people did that. But it was kind of operated by like a car engine at the top. You know, it was just very crude. But that's how they got up there, and then they skied down, and then they went back up. And so this is no longer there either. But the CCC guys were responsible for cutting the trees and kind of laying out trails, although it doesn't look like there's really much of a trail there at the moment. There was one fellow who was in the company at Margaretville who was killed in a dynamite blast. A big rock came up and fell on the lean-to where he was seeking protection, and he died there, which was a terrible tragedy. There were a number of recruits who died in work accidents around the state. This is another camp out near Deposit in western Delaware County in McClure. This camp worked on 2 fire towers, and they did battle with gooseberry bushes, and they planted 2,270,000 trees in the spring of 1934 alone. That is a lot of trees. So this led to some powerful appetite. There's one of the fire towers, Page Pond. That's still there. It's on a Girl Scout camp, Camp Amahami. And here they are digging up gooseberry bushes. And they're putting out fires when they erupted. Whenever there was any kind of like a natural disaster, like a flood or a blizzard, they would send these guys out to help dig people out and rescue folks. So this guy, I love this picture. This is a real picture. I mean, he had a whale of an appetite, and he probably looked like that earlier guy that we saw in the picture, that little skinny runt when he started. But being out there every day and wielding these heavy axes and spades and whatnot, they gained an average of 12 pounds during their stay. Here's some more work in the streams. They did a lot of surveying of state land and building fencing. They fenced in state land for some reason. I don't know if it was a make-work job or if there was some reason why they were fencing, because now state land is not fenced, right? You can just kind of go out there and do whatever you want. This is an interesting thing, and if any of you are into the woods, hiking around the woods, and you stumble across something that looks like this, this is a stone-lined fire pond. They would find a natural spring out in the woods near where they had planted a plantation of white pine or Norway spruce, and they would dig out the spring and line it with stone and let it fill up, ostensibly so that if there was ever a fire there, the state guys, the conservation department guys or crews or volunteers, local fire departments could come up with their Indian packs on their backs. You know what an Indian pack is?
No.
It's a water tank, a heavy water tank with a hose on it. And to go someplace where you can't take a truck or a pumper and there's no fire hydrant, that's what they used to do. And they still do, I think, in some areas, some remote areas. But that's what that was for. So in addition to building the fire towers and trying to wipe out the white pine blister rust and the gypsy moths, they also built these firefighting ponds to protect the trees that they were planting. And here's one of those floods I mentioned that they helped out. There was a huge flood across New York State in 1935 and kept them busy for quite a long time. This is up in Breakabeen in Schoharie County. And this, actually several of these buildings still exist. It's all private land now, owned actually by the town supervisor, the Fulton town supervisor, who has a junkyard there. But he rents out some of these buildings, which were built 85 years ago as temporary structures. They were only supposed to be there for a year or two, and there are people still living in these buildings. Of course, he's put a little, new windows and insulation and stuff. Here's a Norway spruce tree, and this is how they planted these trees. This is how they planted them. So they would be in a line, stretched across a hillside. So one guy would dig up the sod with a mattock. This is not a mattock. I thought this was a mattock when I bought it, and I was since disabused of that notion. This is not a mattock. A mattock would have like I don't know what's the word used, like a fork on the other side that you would, break open the sod with. And so they would take a mattock, open the sod. The next guy behind would have, in a canvas sack across his belly or hanging over his shoulder, a whole bunch of little seedlings, tree seedlings, that came from the state nursery in Saratoga. And he would put that in the hole and stomp on it, and then they would do the next one, and the next one, and the next one. So it was kind of a little bit of a assembly line. There's another fire tower in Stamford. You can walk up this one. This one is still there, and it's open in the summertime. There's usually somebody there to tell you about it. This is a really incredible place too, where hang gliding is often done from off the cliff right there. Has anybody been to Prattsville? Hey, do you recognize this?
I used to swim there.
Yeah, this was a fish barrier that would prevent coarse fish from trout fishing was not an occupation, but a hobby that the state wanted to encourage because trout fishermen travel around, they fish, and they spend money. So they tried to do everything they could do to improve fish habitat in the streams and to keep coarse fish from going up into pristine trout waters, which is what that was about. Here's the Tannersville camp, where they kind of want to do some interest. The camp's no longer there, but this lake, Rip Van Winkle Lake, is there, and they're trying to turn that into a recreation center. This is a beautiful spot, Stony Cove on 214. Anybody been there? It's beautiful. Devil's Campground is right across the way there. This was constructed by the CCC. And this is no longer here either. It's kind of a bad picture. It kind of shows a stone amphitheater. This was at Hunter, North and South Lake, North Lake Campground. So I think the parking lot is right here now. But they did a lot of beautiful stone and timber buildings at these campgrounds. Another picture. And some more. And here's somebody with he's got a mattock and he's digging the dirt. And you can see there's rocks in it. I mean, this was not, it wasn't like they had nice open fields. And there's the sea leaves he's planting. There's a lean-to. They did a lot of lean-tos, did a lot of trails, hiking trails in the Catskills. And this is near where I live. This was a fish hatchery that was established back in the late 1800s. And it was abandoned in 1920 or 29 or something like that. And so the state put the CCC, the local camp, the guys that were in Margaretville, to work, creating a headquarters for the district forest ranger there. So they built a barn. That house there was ultimately moved up the mountain and is now a private residence. And then they sent a bunch of guys out to Beaverkill to a side camp out there to work on the Beaverkill State Campground. Well, eventually things got a little easier with the economy improved somewhat, and of course, what was about to happen? In 1939, 1940? Anybody got any ideas?
Say another.
A big bad war is about to start. So the government was gearing up, building tanks, airplanes, and so these munitions factories were being established, and so a lot of these guys were able to go and get war-related jobs, and so their very exhausting days of working in the woods were over. But a lot of these guys ended up going to war. And remember I said earlier that the fact that the camps were run by the Department of War and by Army officers was pertinent. And it was because when these guys got were drafted or enlisted in the war, in World War II, in the Army or other branches of the service, they were already accustomed to that regimental kind of operation. They already knew how to live in a barracks with a bunch of different guys. So they kind of had a leg up on some of their contemporaries. And you can see very happy guys. This is Harry Collins, who was a CCCer, one of these guys in this picture. And he came back after he was in the seas and bought property and his family continues to use it as a recreation place. So this is, if you see these, sometimes you'll be driving along and you'll see these big squares of green, evergreens on the mountains, and you'll say, that's kind of weird, why is it so symmetrical? Because it's probably a plantation that was planted by the Civilian Conservation Club. This wasn't built by them, but that's the chief attraction at Beaverkill. These guys were ready to go off on the train, head off to wherever they were going. They were taking their trusty dog. They look happy, right? It was an excellent program, and it kept a lot of people alive through the dark days of the Depression. Thank you for listening. Any questions?
Does anybody have any questions about things that they're specifically thinking that they would like to look more into?
There is a state CCC museum, if any of you travel around the state in the summertime or with your families, at Gilbert Lake State Park. It's really a wonderful place to learn more about the CCC and see some of the tools they work with, lots of photographs. Well, thanks a lot, and I hope you enjoy your trip to FDR.
Thank you for coming.